In the hushed chambers of Alexandria's great library, before flames reduced millennia of wisdom to ash, there existed texts so dangerous to the established order that their very possession invited persecution. Among these forbidden manuscripts were the teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great master whose name bridged the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek messenger of divine knowledge. These writings spoke of 7 fundamental principles governing all reality, laws so comprehensive that to grasp them was to hold the master key to both cosmos and psyche. Yet what the uninitiated failed to comprehend, what centuries of literalist interpretation obscured, was that these principles were never meant as mere philosophical speculation about the external world. They were, and remain, a precise cartography of the human interior, a map of consciousness itself encoded in the language of universal law. The Hermetic corpus presents itself as cosmological philosophy, describing the mechanics of manifestation and the architecture of reality. But beneath this apparent concern with the outer world lies something far more subversive and infinitely more practical. The ancient Hermetists understood what modern depth psychology would rediscover through painstaking clinical observation: that the laws governing the movements of stars and the transformations of matter are identical to those governing the movements of thought and the transformations of soul. This was not poetry or metaphor, but recognition of a fundamental truth. The psyche does not merely exist within a universe of law. It is itself structured by these same principles, operates according to their logic, transforms through their agency. To study the Hermetic principles, then, is not to engage in abstract metaphysics, but to undertake the most immediate and intimate investigation possible, the archaeology of one's own consciousness. Carl Jung, working independently in the psychiatric clinics of early 20th century Europe, arrived at remarkably similar conclusions through his exploration of the unconscious. In the dreams, visions, and psychological crises of his patients, he observed patterns that seemed to replicate the stages and symbols of alchemical transformation. More than this, he recognized that the Hermetic worldview, with its insistence on correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, provided the philosophical foundation necessary to understand the psyche as an autonomous reality, a complete world unto itself with its own laws and territories. The Hermetic principles, Jung realized, were not relics of pre-scientific superstition, but sophisticated descriptions of psychological processes that modern consciousness had forgotten how to recognize. The first principle, the principle of mentalism, declares that all is mind, that the universe itself is mental in character. For the literalist, this suggests some form of cosmic idealism, a denial of material reality. But approached psychologically, this principle reveals something far more immediate and verifiable. Your experienced reality, the only reality you can ever directly know, is fundamentally mental. It arises within consciousness, is structured by consciousness, and cannot be separated from the perceiving mind that gives it form. This is not to deny the existence of an external world, but to recognize that you never encounter that world directly. You encounter only your psychological representation of it, a construction assembled from sensation, filtered through expectation, colored by emotion, interpreted through accumulated experience. The Hermetic principle of mentalism points toward a radical realization. You do not live in the world, but in your mind's model of the world. And this model, this interior representation, is not fixed or objective, but constantly generated moment by moment through processes that operate largely outside conscious awareness. The shadows you project onto others, the narratives you construct to explain your experiences, the very framework of meaning through which you interpret events, all of this constitutes the mental universe you inhabit. To work with the principle of mentalism psychologically is to begin taking responsibility for this mental creation, to recognize that changing your experience of reality requires changing not the external conditions, but the mental structures through which those conditions are perceived and interpreted. Jung encountered this principle most directly in his concept of the psychoid archetype, the recognition that at the deepest levels, psyche and matter appear to share a common substrate. The archetypes, those fundamental patterns of human experience, seem to operate at a level where the distinction between mental and physical breaks down. They manifest both as psychological structures, internal forms that shape consciousness, and as external synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that suggest an underlying unity to reality. The Hermetic maxim that all is mind finds its psychological correlate in the discovery that the deepest structures of psyche reach into a realm where subject and object, inner and outer, have not yet differentiated. The second principle, the principle of correspondence, is encoded in the most famous Hermetic maxim, as above, so below, as below, so above. Traditionally interpreted as a statement about the relationship between celestial and terrestrial realms, this principle reveals its psychological depth when understood as describing the relationship between conscious and unconscious, between ego and self, between the superficial personality and the profound depths of psyche. What manifests in your external life, the patterns of relationship, the recurring conflicts, the compulsive behaviors, these are not random but correspond to structures existing in the unconscious. The outer reflects the inner, the visible mirrors the invisible, the known contains traces of the unknown. This is why Jung insisted that the work of individuation required paying attention to external events, not merely as practical circumstances to be managed, but as messages from the unconscious, as manifestations of interior states seeking recognition. A pattern of failed relationships corresponds to an unresolved complex. A chronic inability to assert oneself in the world corresponds to an undeveloped relationship with the archetypal masculine. Recurring dreams of pursuit and entrapment correspond to actual psychological conditions of being pursued and entrapped by unconscious contents. The principle of correspondence transforms the external world into a symbolic text, a continuous revelation of interior conditions written in the language of circumstance and event. But the correspondence operates in both directions, and this is perhaps its most practically significant aspect. Just as the internal state manifests in external patterns, deliberate changes in outer behavior can effect transformations in the psyche. This is the logic behind ritual, why spiritual traditions across cultures employ physical gestures, spoken formulas, material symbols to work psychological changes. The Hermetic magician understands that to change the above, one must work upon the below and vice versa. In psychological terms, this means that altering your external circumstances, your relationships, your daily patterns and practices creates corresponding shifts in unconscious structures. You cannot transform the psyche through thought alone, through mere insight or understanding. The work requires manifestation, embodiment, concrete action in the world that mirrors and reinforces interior transformation. The third principle, vibration, states that nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. Applied psychologically, this principle describes the fundamental instability of consciousness. The fact that psychic states are not fixed conditions, but dynamic processes characterized by constant motion and fluctuation. The ego, that sense of stable identity around which ordinary consciousness organizes itself, is not the static entity it appears to be, but a complex vibration, a standing wave pattern maintained through continuous energetic expenditure. And surrounding this ego vibration are countless other vibrations, other partial personalities, complexes, archetypal energies, each operating at its own frequency, each seeking expression and manifestation. Jung's concept of psychic energy The libido, understood not merely as sexual drive, but as the fundamental life force that animates consciousness, corresponds directly to this Hermetic principle. This energy does not distribute itself uniformly, but concentrates in particular complexes, flows along particular channels, creates particular vibrational patterns that we experience as emotions, moods, obsessions, inspirations. Depression is a low-frequency vibration of psychic energy, mania, a high-frequency vibration, anxiety, a chaotic oscillation between states. These are not abstract descriptions, but phenomenological realities, actual qualities of experienced consciousness. The principle of vibration suggests that psychological transformation is fundamentally a matter of altering the vibrational frequency of consciousness. This is why spiritual practices across traditions emphasize repetitive actions, chanting, prayer, meditation, ritual gesture. These practices work not through their semantic content, but through their ability to entrain consciousness to particular frequencies, to shift the vibrational state of the psyche. In alchemical terms, this corresponds to the application of different degrees of heat, different intensities of transformative pressure applied to the material of consciousness. The slow, sustained heat of contemplative practice gradually elevates the vibrational frequency of awareness. The intense heat of crisis forces rapid shifts, sometimes shattering existing structures entirely. The fourth principle, polarity, declares that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. This is perhaps the most psychologically evident of the Hermetic principles, requiring little translation from cosmic to psychic terms. The entire structure of consciousness is organized around polarities, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, order and chaos, spirit and matter. These are not separate entities but poles of unified realities, and psychological health requires maintaining dynamic relationship between them, rather than identifying exclusively with one pole while repressing or projecting its opposite. Jung's entire psychology can be understood as an extended meditation on the principle of polarity and the necessity of what the alchemists called the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites. The shadow, that repository of rejected and disowned aspects of personality, represents the repressed pole of consciousness, what you most vehemently deny in yourself, what you most violently project onto others, reveals the location of split polarity, the place where wholeness has been fractured into opposed and conflicting fragments. The work of individuation is fundamentally the work of reuniting these poles, not by eliminating one in favor of the other, but by consciously holding the tension between them. This holding of tension is the alchemical vessel, the hermetically sealed container within which transformation occurs. The opposites, when brought into proximity without premature resolution, generate tremendous psychological pressure. This is the refiner's fire, the heat that dissolves rigid structures and allows new configurations to emerge. Most people cannot tolerate this tension and collapse back into one-sided identification. The purely spiritual person who denies the body, the rationalist who represses emotion, the chaotic individual who fears all structure and constraint. But the integrated individual, the one who has achieved even preliminary stages of the alchemical work, develops the capacity to simultaneously hold contradictory truths, to be both X and not X, to exist in the creative space between poles. The Hermetic teaching goes further, suggesting that opposites are not merely related, but actually identical at their extremes, that they meet and transform into one another. This is the alchemical doctrine of enantiodromia, adopted by Jung to describe the tendency of psychological extremes to convert into their opposites. The fanatic becomes the apostate, the ascetic becomes the sensualist, the rigid moralist becomes the libertine. This occurs not randomly, but according to law, the law of polarity itself. which dictates that any energy pushed to an extreme will inevitably swing to its opposite pole. Understanding this principle allows one to work with, rather than against, the natural movements of psychic energy, to recognize when holding a position has become rigid repression rather than genuine development. The fifth principle, rhythm, states that everything flows in and out. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. Applied to consciousness, this describes the cyclical nature of psychological states, the inevitable alternation between expansion and contraction, activity and rest, engagement and withdrawal. The psyche operates according to rhythms that mirror those of nature, daily cycles of alertness and fatigue, monthly hormonal fluctuations, seasonal variations in mood and energy, longer cycles of development and regression that span years or decades. Modern culture, with its emphasis on continuous productivity and stable mood, systematically violates the principle of rhythm. The expectation that one should maintain constant enthusiasm, unvarying output, perpetual availability represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how consciousness actually operates. The psyche requires periods of withdrawal, times of decreased energy and inward focus, to consolidate development and prepare for subsequent expansion. To resist these natural rhythms is to create psychological pathology, to exhaust the organism through forced violation of its inherent periodicity. Jung recognized this principle in his observation that psychological development does not proceed linearly but spirally, returning repeatedly to the same issues and complexes at different levels of awareness. You do not resolve a complex once and permanently, but must work with it repeatedly throughout life as it presents itself in ever deeper forms. This is not failure, but the natural rhythm of individuation, the spiral descent into the depths that characterizes all genuine transformation. The nigredo, that initial stage of blackening and dissolution, does not occur once, but recurs throughout the work whenever consciousness reaches a new level, requiring breakdown of existing structures. The principle of rhythm also explains why spiritual practices must be sustained over time rather than pursued intermittently. The psyche responds to regular rhythmic application of effort in ways that sporadic bursts of intensity cannot achieve. Daily meditation, even brief, establishes a rhythm that entrains consciousness, creates a container within which transformation can unfold. The Hermetic magician understands that timing is crucial, that certain work can only be performed when interior and exterior rhythms align, when the psyche is in its receptive phase rather than its projective phase, when the tide is incoming rather than outgoing. The sixth principle, cause and effect, declares that every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause, everything happens according to law. Psychologically, this is the principle of karma in its most precise sense, not as cosmic reward and punishment, but as the inexorable unfolding of consequences from actions. The way that psychological states and behavioral patterns necessarily generate particular outcomes. You cannot plant thorns and harvest grapes. You cannot maintain rigid defenses and experience intimacy. You cannot repress the shadow and achieve wholeness. The law operates with absolute consistency, though its workings may be obscured by complexity and time delay. Jung encountered this principle most directly in his observation that neurotic symptoms are never random, but always meaningful, always consequences of particular psychological conditions and conflicts. The panic attack has its causes in repressed emotion and unresolved trauma. The compulsion has its origins in split-off portions of personality-seeking expression. The psychosomatic illness manifests psychological conflicts that cannot be addressed consciously. Understanding the principle of cause and effect transforms symptoms from meaningless afflictions into messages, communications from the unconscious that reveal with perfect precision the nature of interior imbalances. But the principle operates prospectively as well as retrospectively. The psychological work you undertake now creates effects that will manifest in future states of consciousness, in the quality of your relationships, in the nature of opportunities that present themselves, in your capacity to respond to crisis and change. The Hermetic teaching emphasizes that nothing is accidental, that what appears as luck or fate is actually the lawful unfolding of causes set in motion by one's own consciousness. This is not determinism, for consciousness itself is capable of introducing new causes, of interrupting karmic chains through awareness and deliberate choice. But it is realism about the consequences of psychological states, about the way that remaining unconscious perpetuates patterns, while becoming conscious introduces the possibility of new causes and therefore new effects. The seventh principle, gender, states that gender is in everything. Everything has masculine and feminine principles. This is perhaps the most misunderstood of the Hermetic teachings, reduced in popular interpretation to simplistic notions of balance or complementarity. But approached through the lens of depth psychology, this principle reveals the fundamental structure of consciousness itself as an interplay between masculine and feminine modes of being and knowing, between what Jung termed logos and eros, between the discriminating principle that separates and defines and the connecting principle that unites and relates. The masculine principle in consciousness is characterized by focus, discrimination, analysis, separation, ascent, penetration into essence. It is the sword that cuts, the light that illuminates, the will that directs and controls. The feminine principle is characterized by receptivity, inclusion, synthesis, connection, descent, embrace of totality. It is the vessel that contains, the darkness that gestates, the wisdom that integrates and holds. Neither is superior to the other, and both are necessary for psychological completeness. The work of individuation requires developing both principles within consciousness regardless of biological sex, achieving what Jung called the union of masculine and feminine in the integrated personality. In alchemical symbolism, this appears as the marriage of sun and moon, king and queen, sulfur and mercury. These are not external partners, but interior polarities that must be consciously related and ultimately united. The solar consciousness, associated with the masculine principle, provides clarity, purpose, active engagement with the world. The lunar consciousness, associated with the feminine principle, provides receptivity to the unconscious, attunement to subtle currents, ability to gestate new possibilities in darkness before bringing them to light. Most individuals, regardless of biological sex, are identified primarily with one principle and have repressed or underdeveloped the other. Men often carry an undeveloped feminine in the anima, women an undeveloped masculine in the animus, and both must be integrated for wholeness. The Hermetic principle of gender suggests that creation itself, whether cosmic or psychological, requires the interaction of these two principles. The masculine provides the initiating impulse, the seed of intention, the focused will. The feminine provides the receptive matrix, the space within which development can occur, the nutrient ground of being. Without masculine focus, consciousness dissipates into vague potentiality. Without feminine receptivity, consciousness becomes rigid, sterile, cut off from the regenerative source. The work of transformation requires both active engagement and passive allowing, both doing and being, both assertion and surrender. What emerges from the sustained study and application of these 7 principles is a recognition that they are not separate teachings, but facets of a single unified understanding, different angles of approach to the same fundamental reality. The Hermetic worldview insists on the absolute unity of being beneath apparent multiplicity, and these principles are simply different ways of describing how that unity manifests and operates. They interpenetrate, each implying and requiring the others. To truly grasp any one principle is to simultaneously grasp them all. For they are not discrete laws, but expressions of a single law, the law of consciousness itself. Jung's work with alchemy revealed that the ancient Hermetists possessed this integrated vision, that their complex and often bewildering symbolism was encoding not just chemical processes, but psychological truths, maps of consciousness transformation that modern depth psychology is only beginning to rediscover. The 7 principles attributed to Hermes Trismegistus are not relics of a pre-scientific past, but anticipations of a post-scientific future, a time when the artificial division between inner and outer, psyche and matter, mind and world, might be recognized as the temporary illusion it has always been. To work with these principles psychologically is to undertake the most radical investigation possible, the transformation of consciousness through recognition of its own laws. This is not an intellectual exercise, but a practical operation, requiring sustained attention to the movements of psyche, willingness to track correspondences between inner and outer, capacity to observe the rhythms and polarities of one's own awareness. It demands everything: the willingness to question every assumption, to release every identification, to die repeatedly to what you thought you were, so that what you actually are might emerge. The work is solitary, for no one else can perform this interior operation on your behalf. Teachers and guides can point the way. Texts and traditions can provide maps, but the actual journey through the territories of your own psyche must be undertaken alone. This is perhaps the most isolating aspect of the Hermetic path, the recognition that psychological transformation, though it may eventually serve collective purposes, begins and proceeds as an individual undertaking. The ancient Hermetists encoded their wisdom in obscure symbols and paradoxical formulas, not to create needless difficulty, but because this knowledge cannot be transmitted directly from one mind to another. It must be earned through one's own effort, discovered through one's own experience, verified through one's own transformation. Yet the promise of the Hermetic teachings and the confirmation of Jungian psychology is that this work is possible, that consciousness can indeed know itself, can understand and work with its own principles, can transform itself from unconscious reactivity to conscious creativity. The 7 principles are not constraints, but descriptions of the very freedom consciousness possesses. The laws that make transformation possible rather than imprisonment within necessity. To know these laws is not to be bound by them, but to gain the capacity to work with them, to use the very structure of consciousness as the instrument of its own evolution. The gold you seek is not hidden in ancient texts or esoteric traditions, though these point the way. It is not dependent on perfect conditions or ideal circumstances, though these may ease the work. The philosopher's stone, that catalyst of transformation that converts base metal into gold, ignorance into wisdom, fragmentation into wholeness, is already present within your own psyche. It is the self itself, that center and totality of being that has never been lost, but only forgotten, obscured by identification with partial and temporary structures. The 7 Hermetic principles are simply 7 descriptions of how this center operates, 7 angles of approach to the same supreme mystery, that you are already the totality you seek, already the unity you long for, and the entire work consists in remembering what you have always been.